They laughed when the black man spoke French. Then he introduced the President of France. The lobby of the International Diplomatic Forum buzzed with the low hum of chatter, clinking coffee cups, and the occasional rustle of paper programs. It was one of those high-profile events in Washington, D.C., where suits were tailored, heels clicked sharply across marble floors, and everyone seemed to carry themselves as if they were 2 minutes away from solving a world crisis. Among the swirl of diplomats, scholars, and young idealists floated a man who didn't quite blend in. Darrell Johnson stood near the registration desk, wearing a faded gray suit, one size too large, and a black backpack slung over one shoulder. He wasn't out of place because of his skin, although for some, that was already enough. It was more in the way he carried himself. He looked calm, patient, like someone who knew exactly where he was, even if others weren't so sure he belonged. There. A security guard approached him, the polite kind of firm in his voice. "Sir, are you with catering? Deliveries go through the service entrance around the back." Darrell blinked once, then smiled softly. "I'm not with catering," he said. The guard looked him over again, uncertain. His eyes flicked to the backpack. "I'm here for the conference," Darrell added. The guard raised a brow, clearly skeptical. "Can I see your badge?" Darrell patted the sides of his coat, then reached into his backpack. "I was told to pick it up at the front desk. They didn't mail it out." Just then, a young woman nearby noticed the exchange. She had a press pass around her neck and a notepad in one hand. Rachel Moore, 22, international relations major at Georgetown, tagging along with a grad student mentor, paused mid-step, watching. She recognized the look on Darrell's face. The way he smiled patiently, didn't raise his voice, didn't push back. It was the smile of someone who had been through this before. Many times. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to wait off to the side," the guard said, "until we can verify." Darrell nodded, stepping away without a word. Nearby, a cluster of middle-aged conference attendees in matching Navy lanyards chuckled, watching the scene. One of them, a balding man with a thick Texas drawl, leaned toward D, his companion. "Bet he's trying to sneak in. Probably just wants free food. Or free air conditioning," the other added. Their laughter was low, conspiratorial, the kind that only felt safe because they were surrounded by people who looked like them. Darrell turned slightly, scanning the room as if trying to find someone he recognized. Then he approached one of the volunteer desks and spoke, not in English, but in French. Fluid, effortless French. "Excusez-moi, pourriez-vous m'indiquer où se trouve la salle des plénières? Je cherche le panneau principal." Rachel turned, fully toward the voice, her brows rising. His pronunciation was flawless, not good, not passable, native. The same group of men overheard and snorted. "Oh, come on," one of them muttered. "Now he's pretending to be French? I mean, seriously?" "Just mimicking a few words," said the balding one, rolling his eyes. "That's not real French." "He probably memorized that line off Duolingo," the other said. Rachel frowned. She couldn't help it. She had studied in Paris for a semester. She knew what real French sounded like, and more importantly, what fake French didn't. What she just heard wasn't fake. It was elegant, idiomatic, natural. She stepped a little closer, pretending to study the bulletin board near the help desk. Darrell, meanwhile, had leaned over slightly, speaking again to the volunteer, who looked a bit flustered and clearly didn't speak the language. He smiled apologetically and repeated his question in English, just as fluidly. "I'm looking for the plenary hall. I was told to check in near the east corridor." The volunteer nodded quickly and pointed. "Yes, go past the escalators, then make a left. Registration B." "Mercy," Darrell said gently. He turned and began walking in that direction. Rachel hesitated for a second, then followed him. not directly behind, but close enough to observe. Something about him didn't add up, and not in a bad way. More like the pieces weren't matching the picture everyone had drawn of him. Darryl stopped briefly at a water fountain, took a sip, then pulled out his phone. He tapped a contact and held it to his ear. Rachel was close enough to hear a soft exchange, again in French. This time, a short, clipped conversation. His tone had changed, slightly more formal. Oui, je suis arrivé. Ils m'ont dirigé vers l'enregistrement B. Je vous rejoins dans 10 minutes. He hung up and slid the phone into his pocket. Rachel tilted her head. That wasn't tourist French. That was the kind of French you spoke when you negotiated trade deals. Or advised ministers. She approached him. Excuse me, she said. I couldn't help overhearing. Are you from France? Darryl turned to her, still smiling, still calm. No. I'm from Atlanta. Rachel blinked. Oh. Sorry, it's just your French is incredible. Merci, he said, nodding. That's kind of you. Are you attending the conference? I am, he said, though apparently that's not obvious. She hesitated, then gave him a sheepish smile. I saw what happened at the entrance. That wasn't cool. Darryl gave a little shrug. It's all right. People make assumptions. I've learned not to take it personally. I'm Rachel, she said, interning with the Global Youth Initiative. Just observing today. Nice. To meet you, Rachel. I'm Darryl. She shook his hand. Do you need help finding registration B? She asked. I think I've got it now. But thank you. They walked together in silence for a few seconds. Can I ask? She said cautiously. Did you grow up speaking French? Darryl chuckled. No. I started learning it in college, then worked in Senegal for a while, then Paris. Picked up a few other languages along the way. Rachel's eyebrows rose. Wow. How many languages do you speak? Darryl thought about it for a second. Comfortably. 5. Functionally. Maybe 8. She let out a low whistle. Okay. That's impressive. Another security guard at the registration area eyed him as they approached. Badge pickup? The guard asked, directly at Darryl. Yes, Darryl replied. Name's Darryl Johnson. Should be under keynote delegation. The guard looked mildly surprised, checked the list, then silently handed him a lanyard. No apology, no recognition. Just the lanyard. Darryl took it without flinching. Rachel noticed the name on the badge. Darryl Johnson, Linguistic Advisor, EU Cultural Diplomacy Program. Her eyes widened slightly. Wait, you're one of the keynote speakers? One of them. Yes. She opened her mouth to respond, but he just smiled and walked ahead. At the corner, Darryl paused and glanced back at the group of men from earlier. They were still there, still watching. But now they were quieter. He met their gaze for a moment, then looked away, not with triumph, not with spite, but with something much harder to define. Grace. Rachel stood there a moment longer, wondering how many times he'd walked into rooms like this and been laughed at before people realized they were looking at the smartest person there. And something in her gut told her this wasn't the last time today someone would underestimate Darryl. Johnson, she followed him again, curious, and for the first time that day, truly awake. The conference hall was an ocean of muted voices, clinking glassware, and the soft shuffle of leather shoes on carpet. Rows of plush seats curved toward the stage like an amphitheater built for quiet. Power, the kind that brokered peace treaties and shifted the fates of nations with a handshake. Rachel walked just behind Darryl as they approached the entry to the main plenary hall. Attendants stood at the doors with tablets, scanning badges. Beyond them, voices swelled in anticipation. A keynote was about to begin. Darryl reached the attendant first. He held up his badge, calm as ever. Hi there, I'm with the EU Cultural Diplomacy Program, here for the 11:00 keynote. The attendant barely glanced at the badge before holding up a hand. Sorry, sir, this session is invite only. I understand, Darrell replied gently. I believe I'm on the speaker list. The attendant frowned. You don't have the access code marked on your badge. If you're a speaker, you need a different badge. Rachel stepped forward. Wait, what? He is one of the speakers. The attendant looked between them. Ma'am, do you work with him? No, Rachel admitted. But I heard him speak earlier, and I saw his badge. It says keynote delegation. That's not the same as keynote speaker, the attendant said curtly. We've had people try to sneak in before. Rachel looked over at Darrell, expecting, hoping, he'd insist or raise his voice, or at least correct them. But he didn't. He just smiled slightly, hands still loosely at his sides. I don't mind sitting outside, he said. I've heard my speech before. Rachel stared at him. But this is your talk, isn't it? I'm just part of a panel. There are others. He looked at the attendant. Do you mind if I sit in the side section? The attendant hesitated, then exhaled sharply. Fine, just over there. Back row only. If we run out of space, I'll have to ask you to step out. Understood, Darrell said. Rachel trailed behind him as they moved toward a row near the wall, far enough from the front that he might as well have been watching through a window. She sat down next to him. A few nearby attendees noticed. They gave Darrell a once-over, the bag, the slightly worn suit, the calm that didn't match their expectations. One woman leaned in toward her colleague. Must be press, she whispered. Or staff, the other murmured. Though they're not usually allowed in this session. Rachel clenched her jaw. She turned to Darrell. They shouldn't be treating you like this. Darrell gave her a small glance. Like what? Like you don't belong here. He looked at her, amused. People always think that, until they don't. Before she could respond, the doors closed with a soft thud, and the lights dimmed slightly. A hush fell over the room as the event moderator took the stage. On the massive screen behind him, the words scrolled in elegant typography. Session 2, Linguistic Diplomacy in a Fragmented World Beneath It. The names of the panelists appeared in sequence. And then, there it was. Darrell Johnson, Linguistic. Advisor to Francophone Heads of State, EU Cultural Diplomacy Program. A few necks craned toward the screen. A man in the third row turned to an usher. Excuse me, that man, Johnson, is he here already? I believe so, the usher replied. He checked in about 15 minutes ago. The man's eyes swept the hall. When his gaze landed on Darrell, his eyebrows lifted sharply. He leaned toward a woman beside him. That can't be right. Rachel watched it all, and something in her chest began to tighten. It wasn't just the disbelief. It was the way people were whispering now, furtively glancing back toward them, as if realizing that someone had slipped past their unspoken filter, a man they hadn't pre-approved. A woman 2 rows ahead turned around and offered Darrell a tight, practiced smile. Oh, you're Darrell Johnson? Yes, he said pleasantly. Oh. Her smile froze. I thought, well, I didn't expect. She caught herself, cheeks flushing. Nice to meet you. Darrell gave a small nod. Likewise. She turned back quickly. Rachel was nearly vibrating in her seat. A few minutes into the panel, the murmurs reached a suited man with a diplomatic crest on his lapel, clearly a VIP. He stood, walked to the nearest organizer, and spoke in a low, sharp voice. Rachel couldn't hear what he said, but she caught a few key phrases as he gestured toward Darrell. He's making some guests uncomfortable, not properly credentialed. Please verify his background. The organizer looked taken aback but nodded and pulled out a tablet. Darrell, meanwhile, hadn't moved. His posture was relaxed, hands resting in his lap. On the screen, The moderator was introducing the panelists one by one. Joining us today, we have Dr. Eva Sabo from the Council of Europe, Minister Hamidou Diallo, representing the Francophone Alliance, and Mr. Daryl Johnson, whose linguistic expertise has shaped cultural diplomacy across Africa, Europe, and North America. Mr. Johnson has advised multiple heads of state and pioneered translation frameworks now used by the African Union. A ripple moved through the crowd. Rachel glanced sideways. Daryl's name was being spoken on stage, his credentials displayed in 10-foot-high letters. And still, someone was double-checking his presence with a scowl and suspicion. She leaned in slightly. "They're checking your background. I know. You don't care?" "I care," he said softly. "Just not the way you think." Rachel didn't understand. Daryl continued, eyes still on the stage. "Every time someone questions if I belong, they reveal more about themselves than about me. I used to get angry. Now I just let them walk into their own shadows." Silence stretched between them for a moment. On stage, the moderator began the discussion, and the panelists spoke about linguistic bridges, colonial history, and cultural sensitivity. Daryl's turn hadn't come yet. Another usher approached, quietly, bending to speak near Daryl's shoulder. "Sir, we apologize for the earlier confusion. There's a reserved seat for you near the stage. If you'd like, I can escort you there." Daryl looked at Rachel. "Want to come?" She blinked. "Me? You've got better ears than most of the people in this room." Rachel gave a tight smile, standing. As they moved down the aisle, now flanked by ushers and the spotlight of realization, the very same man who had asked for Daryl's background watched them pass. His expression was stiff, unsure whether to offer an apology or retreat into silence. Daryl didn't look at him. He took his seat near the front, center of the panel table, adjusted his mic, and waited. Rachel took a guest chair just behind the Asti row of panelists, not officially part of the show but close enough to feel the heat of it. The moderator turned toward Daryl. "Mr. Johnson, as someone who has navigated diplomatic language across nations and cultures, what do you think is the greatest misunderstanding people have about linguistic identity?" Daryl didn't speak right away. He looked out over the room, scanning faces, many of which still carried faint traces of shock. Then he smiled. "I think the biggest misunderstanding," he said calmly, "is assuming language belongs to one, people, or that speaking a language, well, makes you an outsider rather than a bridge." He paused. "I've been told I speak French too well to be American, that my Arabic sounds suspicious, that I don't look like a linguistic expert. I've learned that sometimes it's not about the words you use, it's about the mouth people expect them to come from." The room was very quiet. Daryl continued. "But languages don't belong to nations. They belong to people. And people, as we keep learning, are far more complicated than their badges or their skin." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Others nodded slowly. Rachel sat back, a small smile tugging at her lips. He wasn't loud. He wasn't angry. He didn't need to be. Every word was a scalpel. And in this room of polished egos and closed assumptions, Daryl Johnson had just performed the most graceful dissection of all. For a moment, no one moved. The crowd sat frozen, in polite, breathless tension as Daryl Johnson rose from his seat and walked to the center of the stage. The backdrop screen flickered behind him, his name glowing in soft white against a blue diplomatic seal. Daryl Johnson, linguistic advisor to Francophone heads of state, the same man who'd been mistaken for a delivery driver, the same man who'd been blocked at the door. The man no one had believed. The host of the session, now visibly flustered, stepped back and motioned to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Johnson." Scattered applause rose, uncertain and sparse. Some clapped out of embarrassment. Others because they simply didn't know what else to do. Daryl approached the podium without haste. He didn't need to hurry. The room already belonged to him. Rachel, seated just behind the front row, watched with wide eyes. Something in her chest stirred, the weight of realization and the quiet thrill of witnessing the moment before a storm. Darrell adjusted the mic with calm precision. He looked out over the sea of suited delegates and polished intellects. Then he began. "In this room," he said in smooth, unshaken English, "are people who have the power to shape how nations speak to each other. And, more importantly, how they listen." There was something in his voice. A grounded power. Not loud, not performative, but deep like the roots of an old tree. "Language is more than words," he continued. "It is memory. It is music. It is the rhythm of culture and pain and joy passed down across centuries. It can build a bridge or burn one." A few heads nodded slowly. Phones came up. Some attendees began recording. And then, with barely a pause, Darrell shifted. "Mais ce que nous oublions trop souvent," he said, transitioning seamlessly into French, "c'est que la langue n'est pas qu'un outil de communication, mais aussi un outil de domination et de libération." The French was perfect. Not just fluent, native, fluid, alive. A rustle moved through the French delegates. A few sat forward, listening more intently. Rachel looked around. Some people seemed shocked, others wary. A man who looked like Darrell, speaking French like that? It was shaking their sense of order. But Darrell wasn't done. He pivoted again. والأخطر من ذلك أن اللغة يمكن أن تصبح جدارا خفيا يمنعنا من رؤية الإنسان خلف اللهجة. Now Arabic poured from his mouth, rhythmic and textured. Even those who didn't understand the words could feel the cadence, the gravity of what was being said. "And when we ignore the depth of a language," he returned briefly to English, "we ignore the soul of its people." Then, without warning, he moved again. 语言不仅是信息的传递，更是文化的载体。忽视一种语言，就是忽视一个民族的历史。Mandarin now, clear, measured, carried with the weight of someone who understood. The tonal complexity, the subtle inflections, not just from study, but from respect. Gasps. Audible now. In 4 languages, Darrell had spun a web around the room. One that said, "You thought I didn't belong. You measured me with the wrong rulers." Now he paused. He looked down briefly, collected his breath, then lifted his head once more. "In every diplomatic mission I've ever joined," he said, returning, "to English, I've seen the same dynamic. People who assume mastery belongs to those who look a certain way. People who think fluency only counts when it wears the right suit." A beat of silence. Then, from somewhere near the back of the room, a voice rang out. It was a man. Late 50s, French accent, expensive suit, tight expression. He stood up, raising a hand slightly. "Mr. Johnson," he called out. "If I may," Darrell gestured. "Please." The man cleared his throat. "If you're as fluent as you seem," he said with a slight edge, "perhaps you wouldn't mind translating this." He launched into an elaborate, obscure sentence, an archaic form of French, laced with idioms and structural flourishes, rarely heard outside of 18th century literature. It wasn't just a question. It was a trap, a test, meant to trip him, a way to prove that even a polyglot had limits. The room hushed. Rachel's eyes snapped to Darrell, but Darrell didn't flinch. He let the sentence settle in the air, repeated it softly under his breath, then smiled, not smugly, but as if remembering a favorite line of poetry. Then he spoke. First, he gave the precise word-for-word translation into modern French, then into English. Then, and this was when the room leaned in, he explained. "That phrase," he said, "originates in the 1778 Lettres d'Alembert sur les spectacles by Rousseau. It was later paraphrased by Diderot and misunderstood in diplomatic circles during the 19th century negotiations between France and Algeria." He stepped away from the podium and walked forward slightly, addressing the room now without the barrier of a mic. "It doesn't just mean what it says. It reflects a fear that culture, when staged and performed, loses its authenticity. That diplomacy, like theatre, can become a farce if the language we use isn't rooted in truth. The man who had asked the question, once so confident, now sat slowly, his mouth tight, eyes uncertain. The silence that followed was not awkward. It was reverent. The kind that happens when people are forced to reckon with what they just witnessed. Rachel felt it in her spine. This wasn't just a speech. It was a quiet dismantling, not of individuals, but of the biases they'd brought with them. Darryl returned to the mic. He looked around the room once more. "I came here to talk about diplomacy," he said. "But maybe what we really need to talk about is humility." And then he bowed, his head slightly. "Thank you." A beat, then applause. Real this time. Not scattered, not reluctant, but full, rising, waves of it, crashing down row by row. People stood, not all, but many. Even those who had doubted him, even those who had tried to catch him off guard. Rachel stood too, heart pounding. Because in that moment, the man they had laughed at, the man they had almost barred from entering the room, had just taught every single one of them what power really sounded like, and he hadn't even raised his voice. As the thunder of applause finally ebbed, Darryl remained still at the podium. Some delegates were still on their feet, others stunned into stillness. The whispers had stopped. Even the cameras had lowered, as if sensing that something deeper than protocol was about to unfold. Darryl let the silence breathe for a long moment. Then, with a calm that somehow carried more weight than any roar, he spoke. "And now," he said softly, "I have the honor of introducing someone very dear to me, a colleague, a mentor, a friend." His voice didn't change, but the tone shifted, and it pulled everyone forward in their seats. "He is a man who believed in me," Darryl continued, "at a time when few others even saw me. A man whose country is a beacon of culture, diplomacy, and depth, and whose leadership reminds us that respect is not given to appearances, but to authenticity." Rachel leaned forward, mouth slightly open. Darryl glanced around the room. Then came the sentence that would echo for years in diplomatic circles. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, eyes calm and steady, "it is my privilege to introduce His Excellency, the President of the French Republic." Gasps swept through the hall like a wind. There was a pause, as if the audience didn't believe what they'd just heard, and then the double doors at the back of the hall opened. Security stepped in first. Cameras clicked. Suits shifted nervously in their seats, and through the entryway strode a tall, silver-haired man in a dark navy suit, bearing the unmistakable presence of a world leader. President Henri Laurent, the President of France. Every head turned. Delegates whispered names. Some stood instinctively, but what happened next silenced the room more than his arrival ever could. The president did not walk toward the center of the stage like royalty entering a court. He walked straight to Darryl, and he smiled. Not a diplomatic smile, not a rehearsed expression for cameras. It was genuine. And then, to the quiet astonishment of the crowd, the president extended both hands, took Darryl's, and said something softly in French. "Mon frère," my brother. Then he embraced him. Not a formal handshake. Not the distant nod of hierarchy, but the kind of embrace that tells the world, "This man matters to me." A long moment passed before they turned to the audience. President Laurent stepped up to the microphone as Darryl moved modestly to the side. For several seconds, the president looked over the crowd. "I had a speech prepared," he said in fluent English, voice rich and deliberate, "but I will not be using it." A ripple went through the room. "Because what needs to be said," he continued, "is not written on paper. It is written in memory." He turned slightly toward Darryl. "I first met Mr. Johnson over a decade ago," the president said. at a United Nations summit in Geneva. I was not yet president. He was not yet world-renowned. A small chuckle passed through the crowd, tentative. He was a young interpreter, sitting at the back of the room, headphones on, invisible to most. He paused. But not to me. People leaned in. I watched this man, this young man, navigate 3 languages in 5 minutes. I watched him adjust tone, not just vocabulary. I saw him translate emotion, not just words. And I thought to myself, there is genius here. A pause, a beat of breath. I did not see a man in a cheap suit. I did not see a black man. I did not see a background or a status. He looked over the audience slowly. I saw a mind. I saw a voice. And I saw a bridge between worlds. Applause began to rise, organically, respectfully. But more than his mastery of language, the president continued, was his mastery of listening. You see, Daryl understands something that many diplomats do not, that before you translate, you must first understand, that before you speak, you must feel. Now the applause grew louder. Delegates from African nations were standing, francophone. Leaders nodded, and President Laurent gave the final line with quiet force. This man is not just a linguist, he is a global treasure, and any room that doubts his place is a room not ready for the future. The entire hall stood. No one hesitated now. From the front row to the last, people rose, some clapping, others simply watching in silence, their own assumptions unraveling quietly inside them. Rachel's hands trembled as she joined the standing crowd. Her throat was tight with emotion, because in that moment the scene from earlier, the laughter in the hall, the mocking voices, the disbelief, it all felt so small, so shameful. And the man they had laughed at? He stood at the center of the stage, shaking hands with the President of France, smiling, not with pride, but with peace, because Daryl didn't need applause. He had always known who he was, and now, so did everyone else. The conference hall emptied, slowly. But the silence lingered, not the uneasy hush of awkwardness. This was different. It was the weight of reflection, the kind of stillness that settles in after something truly important has happened. Daryl stood near the back now, sipping a simple cup of black coffee from a paper cup. No fanfare, no bodyguards, just a man in a worn suit who had quietly changed the temperature of the room, and perhaps a little more than that. Rachel found him there, beside a large column where the light slanted down through the atrium skylight. She approached cautiously, heart pounding in her chest, the events of the day still swirling in her mind. He noticed her, gave her a soft nod. She hesitated, then said, "I owe you an apology." Daryl didn't respond at first. He just sipped his coffee. Rachel pressed on, her voice shaking slightly. "When I first saw you this morning, I didn't know who you were. And even though I didn't laugh like the others, I still assumed. I assumed you didn't belong, that maybe you were lost, or delivering something, or—" She stopped, flustered. Daryl finally turned to her. His eyes were calm, grounded. "But you didn't laugh," he said simply. "That was enough." Rachel blinked. "I still judged you." "And you're here now," he replied, trying not to make that mistake again. Rachel bit her lip, her eyes glistening. "Do people always treat you like that?" Daryl looked around at the now mostly empty room. "Not always, but often enough that I stopped being surprised." She frowned. "Doesn't it make you angry?" A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "It used to," he said, "but anger wears heavy on the soul. And if I carried it into every room, I'd be doing exactly what they expect of me." Rachel said nothing. She just stood there, feeling the weight of everything he wasn't saying. Then someone else approached, cautiously. It was one of the men from the group who had mocked Daryl earlier. The one who'd made the snide comment about his French. The one who'd scoffed when he took a seat near the front. He was older, white, well-dressed, and visibly uncomfortable now. He wrung his hands nervously, as if trying to squeeze the shame out of them. "Mr. Johnson," the man said, clearing his throat. Darrell turned slightly, expression unreadable. The man began again. "I owe you an apology, a real one. I was ignorant. I judged you without knowing a thing about you, and I've spent my career in diplomacy preaching about openness and inclusion. Today you showed me what that actually looks like." There was a long pause. Rachel held her breath. The man swallowed, then added, "If it's not too forward, I was wondering, do you ever take on private students?" Darrell raised an eyebrow. "I'd like to learn French," the man said. "Properly. From someone who understands the culture, not just the words." The moment hung there. Then Darrell extended a hand. "Do you have patience?" The man blinked. I think so." Darrell smiled. "Then yes, I can teach you." The man looked both relieved and surprised. "Thank you, truly." As he walked away, Rachel gave Darrell a curious look. "You could have turned him down." Darrell shrugged. "And then what? I prove him right? That we hold grudges? That we're waiting for payback?" She nodded slowly, her voice soft. "So, this was never about revenge." "No," he said, watching sunlight filter through the glass above. "It was never about making anyone feel small. It was about reminding them that we never were." Later that evening, Rachel sat in her dorm room, eyes scanning her laptop screen. The entire conference had been recorded. Most of it would be archived and forgotten, but she had captured something different. She had caught Darrell's speech on her phone. Not the official angle, but the real one. The way the audience reacted, the tone in his voice, the pause before he introduced the President of France. She hesitated only briefly, then she clicked upload. She titled it simply, "They laughed when the black man spoke French. Then he introduced the President of France." Within minutes, the video began to circulate. By midnight, it had reached every continent. By morning, millions had seen it. Teachers showed it in classrooms. Diplomats shared it on social media with captions about humility and brilliance. People who had never once considered race, language, or bias found themselves deeply moved. Comment sections filled with messages. "This changed my perspective. I cried when the president hugged him. I saw myself in this man." Darrell's inbox filled with invitations, conferences, lectures, book deals, interviews. Journalists called. Universities offered honorary degrees. But when Rachel found him again a week later, sitting in the same local coffee shop, he was exactly as before, sipping a small black coffee, reading a worn paperback on African proverbs. "You're famous now," she said, sliding into the seat across from him. He looked up and smiled. "So I'm told." "You could be anywhere in the world." "I am," he replied. "Right here." Rachel laughed softly. "You're really not going to change anything, are you?" "I already have," he said, turning another page. "But I don't need to change for the world to notice. I just need to stay true." A long silence followed, comfortable now. Then Rachel asked, almost timidly, "Why languages?" Darrell looked out the window. "Because languages teach you to listen," he said. "And the world doesn't listen enough." She nodded slowly. Then, almost as an afterthought, she asked, "If you had one thing to tell everyone watching that video, what would it be?" Darrell closed the book, looked her in the eyes, and said, "You don't need to shout to be heard. You just need to say the right thing. At the right time, in any language. End of story." Thanks for listening. If this story moved you, share it with someone who still believes in the power of kindness, humility, and being heard without shouting. Until next time, stay thoughtful, stay kind, and never underestimate quiet strength.